All right, I think we are live. I'll give people a second to filter in. But in the meantime, how are things going, Howard? How was Gen Con?
Oh, Gen Con was exhausting and a learning experience and a lot of fun.
Hell yeah.
I got to do my dwarven paladin from the Southern Holds character who has a sort of a foghorn leghorn accent instead of the Scottish accent.
Excellent.
And the GM introduced me as lawful finger licking good,
Oh my god.
which oh
Was were you just a poor country lawyer from the Deep Holds?
no, it's just a paladin. I'm a guest on the Trash Heroes podcast,
Nice.
and they were getting together at Gen Con, and yeah, so that was a lot of fun.
Hell yeah. That sounds truly delightful.
I grew up in the South, and so there's a certain measure of code switching there. I never actually grew up with anyone who talks like that, but the just the pacing and the drawl and the long wait before dropping a vocabulary word and the pseudo stutter. Son, I say, son, I'd rather not detect evil because I can tell neither you nor I will be particularly appreciative of the results.
I find that one of my go-tos when I'm GMing or just playing D&D generally is a similarly like goofy Southern accent. It can be a really fun one, and it fits the setting well.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen. There's like a TikTok trend of people realizing how good Shakespeare sounds in Southern accents. And like sort of deep drawl, and I think there's something similar to why it works so well in fantasy settings. It's just a good time. All right. Well, shall we get started with some questions? So, thank you everyone for coming to this month's Writing Excuses Q&A live stream. I'm Dongwan Song, and I'm joined by my co-host this week, Howard Taylor. This is a monthly series we do where two of us will get on stream and answer some questions submitted by our lovely Patreon supporters. The stream is free for everyone, but if you want to have your question answered, go to patreon.com/writingexcuses and send them to us, and we can consider them ahead of time and give you a little bit more thorough of an answer. So, yeah. Shall we get started? Howard, do you want to read the first question?
I will read the first question. This one comes to us from Joseph Barter. Well, it's official. I haven't written anything new in my book for more than a month, so I am now in a slump. What's the worst slumps you've experienced, both pre and post professionally? What are your slump busting techniques? Taking a few days off to focus on writing, aggressive scheduling, tub of ice cream?
Tub of ice cream is always a good answer. I would love to hear from you first on this one, Howard. I mean, you had a daily comic for years and years and years. That is a tough schedule to keep up with that doesn't allow for a lot of slumps in there. A lot of just sort of like, I'm hitting a burnout line. I need to take some time off.
Yeah.
How did you manage that?
When I was on my A game, I could turn out 3 weeks of comics in 1 week.
Mm-hmm.
And I regularly would turn out 2 weeks of comics in 1 week. My buffer ran anywhere from 14 to 60 days ahead. And so if I felt a little burnt out, if I needed to take a couple of days off, I could. And would never notice. It would never
Mhm.
be a problem. A slump, a full-on slump of a month of not getting anything done would have been problematic. But I guess I got lucky and never had that. I mean,
Did did you ever get
two of my
back
children
down
were
to
born. Two of my
Yeah.
children were born during that time frame, and I separated my shoulder in 2006, and had to take a couple of weeks off from drawing. But just the fact that I worked ahead meant that what people saw of, comic every day without fail, Howard's a machine. No, the actual machine is the machinery by which things are automatically uploaded to the internet. Yes, that is a
Mhm.
machine. It fulfills all of the definitions of machine. Howard is a lump of sorry wetware who feeds the machine when he's able, uh, and creates the illusion of looking amazing. That said, now that Schlock Mercenary is done, I could not do that again. My health has been
Mhm.
such that I would argue that I'm probably in the worst slump I've ever been in now, because I was sick for, well, I've been sick, long COVID, since 2020. We didn't know what it was forever. But the first half of this year, very non-productive. Just now trying to get back into the swing of things, and it's hard. What strategies do I have? Um, you're not going to like any of them. Sit down in the chair with the work in front of you and start trying to do it. And if you
Yeah.
can't, you just keep trying to do it. And you do that for an hour, and hey, maybe at the end of the hour, you realize, wow, I really just can't do it right now. And you get up and do something else. Or maybe
Yeah.
at the end of the hour, you realize, oh, I don't know what had me blocked, but apparently the discomfort of sitting here bored staring at the page was enough to clear my authorial colon.
Yeah. I mean, I think I talk about this a lot where well, I don't talk about the clearing one's authorial colon. I think that's a particularly Howard phrasing, but can you guys hear me? Okay.
Yes, you
Okay.
froze for just a moment, but
All right. Okay. My connection seems to be a little unstable, so I apologize for that today. But the thing that I like talking about is cultivating boredom is a really, really useful thing to do. And that's a little bit like what Howard was saying right there, is making space for yourself to be well and truly bored is a thing that I like to do when I find myself struggling with motivation or struggling with focus or whatever it is. Like if I'm kind of riding that burnout line a little bit, then for me, often a thing that I need to do is make some space for my brain to recharge. So two things sort of combined, cultivating some kind of creative practice, right? Like doing a creative thing that is unrelated to the thing that you are doing for money, that it's unrelated to the thing that you're pursuing as your main creative career. Like having a thing that's just for you is something I can't recommend highly enough. And on top of that, if you make space for yourself to be understimulated to the point that you want to crawl out of your skin and you're going crazy, then you're ready to work again, right? So taking the time off. And when I say cultivating boredom, I mean like no looking at TikTok, get off social media, don't be
yes.
playing a video game, don't be watching a show, do not be doing house chores. Sit your butt down on the couch and stare at the wall until you feel like you would rather do anything else than sit there, and then just force yourself to be in it a little bit longer, right? Like boredom, I think, is one of the most powerful tools a creative person has to make good work. Because if you free your brain up enough, if you like purge your authorial colon, if you like really evacuate whatever's blocking you up there, then you'll have the space to come up with better ideas than you've ever had. You'll have the space to make the kind of connections you need to make to do the work, right? Um, that is all assuming that you're also tending to your basic mental health, like you're not depressed, you're, you know, eating well, you're getting some, you're moving some, you're getting fresh air, you're getting vitamin D, whatever it is, right? The things that you need to do generally to take care of yourself, make sure you're doing those first and foremost, right? But if your baseline is okay and you're still struggling to work, then I recommend starting a new hobby, do something that's creative, and then also make space for yourself to sit and do truly nothing. Um, and I think that can be really empowering. Cool. Second question.
Let's do it.
All right.
You want to read this one?
Sure. This one's from May. I'm working on an ensemble fantasy heist story and worried it's too ambitious for a first novel. Should I go for it? How do I keep the novel length reasonable when it's going to need world building and plot weight for many characters? Is this even an answerable question? What do you think, Howard? Do you have a thought on this one?
Yeah. In reverse order, yes, this is an answerable question. Caveat, I'm likely to be wrong. But every question is answerable because I'm a mediocre white man.
I think all questions are answerable provided you accept the possibility the answer is wrong.
Yes, yes. How to keep the novel length reasonable when it's going to need world building and plot weight for many characters. I would worry about that later. The first question, should I go for it? This was not audible, but it's you because you pasted the text in on screen, people can read it. It's worried it's too ambitious for a first novel! ! That exclamation point says to me that this is an idea about which you're enthusiastic. If you're enthused for an idea, then the answer to should I go for it is always yes. Because if you fail, it'll be more fun than if you fail at something where you're like, oh, I'm not ready to do the idea I really love. So I'm going to do this smaller thing that I'm not as excited about, but that I think I'll be better at. Aim high.
Swing for the fences.
Swing for the fences. Absolutely. Now, that second question, how to keep the novel length reasonable when it's going to need world building and plot weight and so on and so forth. We've got 15 years of podcasts that include a bazillion answers to all of the various pieces of this. And for now, hey, just write what you're enthusiastic about. And if it gets bloaty, if it gets slow, if you realize it really was too much, maybe it gets edited. Maybe it gets an editing pass. Maybe it goes in the trunk. I'm pretty sure that halfway through something huge like this, a fresh new idea will come to you that you'll be even more excited about. And so you're not gonna suffer for putting this in the trunk if it legitimately turns out to be beyond your current skills. But I'm all for camp. Go for it.
It's easier to take things out than to add stuff in. It's easier to edit out than to edit in. I think underwriting is much more challenging. And in terms of like how to keep that link down, I think Howard, as Howard was saying, like go to the archive. There's a little too many questions or too many possible things to end up with that link to talk about it, this broadly. But what I would say is really focus on, really make sure that each character has stakes that feel essential, and then tie the world building questions to those stakes, right? So I think, I said this to someone literally yesterday. I was talking to a writer who was trying to figure out like how to balance unfolding world building information. And the thing that I said was, if anybody ever tells you that you're info dumping or that your world building is too complicated, they're not actually talking about that. What they're actually saying is your stakes aren't strong enough. if anybody says your world is too complex, what they're actually saying is there's no clear stakes for these characters, right? So what you want to do is when you're introducing this many different characters and having a cast this broad, is make sure that everything is tying back to really clear things that the characters want and need and aren't getting in some way, shape, or form, right? Some aspect that is really legible as to how each character feels about themselves, feels about another character, and how that will be impacted if things don't work out for them that they wanted to, right? So, I mean, you are definitely starting on, I don't know if it's starting on hard mode, but like you're not starting on the easiest setting here. But that's okay. I think that just because it's your first novel, I see tons of people start in the easy setting and get nowhere with it because it's not pushing them in the way. So they're not excited about the story. If you're excited to tell this story, then tell this story. Sometimes people's first novel is an incredibly difficult, complicated thing. Maybe you'll hit it out of the park, maybe you won't. What you will do is learn a lot about what it is you want to be doing and how you want to be working and what's important to you, you know? So absolutely, Howard's right. Anytime you're asking yourself, should I go for it? The answer is yes, go for it. Worst case scenario, you wrote a thing that isn't immediately publishable. Worst case scenario, this book didn't work out. There's always another book. The biggest thing that I see all the time is people struggling with is the idea, is this fear that I'll never have another book idea again. That I wrote this book and it didn't work and now I'm done. And it's like, that's not how it works. You will have other ideas because you're a writer, you're a creative person. You already are because you're thinking of doing this. You're listening to us talk. You're spending your time engaging with this process in a deep enough way that I guarantee you will have more ideas again. It may be hard to find one that you really love. It may be hard to find the way in, but part of being a writer is getting practiced at spotting what ideas are developable into a longer form story, right? So I said,
and you froze again, Dongwon.
God damn it. Where did I cut out? Did I finish my thought before I cut out?
It sounded like you were saying I said, or
I guess what I'm saying is, I don't remember where I left off there, but basically always take the swing, always go for it. If you have the idea, there will always be more ideas, you know? And so if you're feeling moved to work on a thing, work on the thing, see where it goes. If it doesn't work out, that's okay. Move on to the next project. There's always going to be another project in the pipeline. And I think the thing that you'll get more practiced at is learning how to develop ideas into something worth developing and how to have project 2, project 3, project 4 in the pipeline already as you're working on project 1. And then once you get that rhythm up and running, now you have enough options that you'll start to like really find something that hits for you. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. All right, so we also solicited some questions from the Discord for tonight's little Q&A. So we're going to jump to our first Discord question. Howard, do you want to read this one from Amber?
Sure. Do you pre-read and prepare your answers in advance when podcasting? If not, how do you keep the podcast from going over time when recording?
We do so much immaculate prep. It's just like the most detailed outlines you could possibly imagine. No, that's not true at all. We are getting more disciplined about how we prep for things. But I also think in part what makes the podcast work is the extemporaneous aspect of it, right? Because we're not a group who's out here with like, here's our lesson plan, here's the 10 things we're going to explain, right? I think there are modes in which each of us individually are providing that content, whether it's like through newsletters, lectures, in-person lectures, whatever it is, one of Mary Robinette's like Patreon classes. If you want like the really structured way to go through it, that's a great way to do it. I think what we bring to the table as a group is what emerges through the conversation as we bounce off each other and as we introduce new ideas. We actually kind of deliberately don't talk too in depth about the subject before we start recording because we want the spontaneity of us bouncing off each other and sparking ideas and getting excited about what the other person says. Like we will actively stop ourselves if we find ourselves going too deep on something before the mics are hot, and we'll just be like, wait, hold up, we should save this we're burning pod, right? Like this is what the podcast is for.
Yeah.
And then to the second half of the question, we've never gone over time. We are 15 minutes long, and we've always stuck to that. That's never changed. I don't know. What do you think about all this, Howard?
Well, it's the tagline 15 minutes long because you're in a hurry and we're not that smart has always been so critical to us because it's a haiku and we'll just never let that go. So I'm going to double down on the joke. Yeah, we've never gone overtime. What are you talking about?
I have also never stayed connected for more than 30 seconds.
With regard to preparing answers in advance, one of the things that I've learned over the years is that there's this element to conversational storytelling and this element to participating in a discussion that is, I will frame things in my head before I start talking, where what I'm going to say has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an end. And maybe I don't know what the end is when I start at the beginning, but I know that it has to have a beginning and a middle and an end. And I've had a lot of practice at it. So I will start to talk and I will say the thing, and then I will drop a sentence that says, and now I'm done saying the thing, which lets me hand it off to somebody else. And that's a skill that I've just had to develop it over a decade and a half of doing this. And it comes in handy in social situations as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think podcasting the way we do
because I could be a total bore in social situations, just stomping on other people's lines and just never shutting up. Oh, I'm sorry.
How could one ever interrupt? Oh, no, not at all. Not at all. This is the other secret of the podcast is all of us are incorrigible interrupters and we jump on each other all the time. But because of that, we have a really easy flow, I think, in the conversation, and we all really trust each other. And, exactly what Howard was saying was we know how to toss from one to the other and sort of like see when someone's reaching the end of a thought and pick it up from there. Which does lead to some hilarious bloopers every now and again. When in our last recording retreat, I don't remember what it was. I think I was talking and I tried to toss it to the group, but everyone just turned and looked at me and nobody picked it up. And it was just like, it happens so rarely that we all just stood there. We just ended up bursting out laughing because it was sort of like we had like this moment where nobody was talking, and that so rarely happens to us. So anyways, that's when you fix it in post. That's what editing is.
Do you pre-read and prepare your answers? No, we do not.
We do not. We plan out and schedule the curriculum for the year. We figure out what it is we're talking about for each episode. Generally, somebody's in charge. We assign one person to quote unquote drive each episode so that they are sort of in charge of the flow of conversation. That's the point person that we all look to for our cue of like, are we going to break? Where are we going with this conversation? They're generally in charge of leading the conversation. It's kind of how we do it. And if, welcome to the behind the scenes, how the sausage gets made. You can tell who's driving because they're the first person who talks each episode. They're the one who's going to introduce the topic. And then, so we have a couple little things here and there to make sure that it's moving nice and fluid. But no, we're not pre-reading and doing a lot of prep aside from like the bare bones outline of it.
Okay. Hey, this next question looks like a you thing.
It does kind of seem like a me thing. Asked me to talk about my career path and how you might get an editing job in 2024. So this could be an entire hour-long talk on its own, but I'm going to speed run it and go as fast as I can here. So career path. I started out working at a literary agency in like 2005, I think. I am 19 years into this career, and I'm doing fine. I'm not crazy at all. It's going great. So I started out at an agency and I worked there for years as an assistant, working for a literary agent, and did mostly nonfiction and literary fiction and poetry. Very different from the kind of stuff I work on now. I worked there for a few years, realized at the time that I didn't really want to be a literary agent, and made the jump to editorial. I made that jump literally by running into a friend at another mutual friend's birthday party. I didn't know this person very well. They have since become like one of my very closest dear friends. They were an editor over at Orbit and were like, hey, we're hiring this position. You should apply for it. So I threw my hat in the ring, went in for an interview, ended up getting that job that week, which was very exciting. It was one of the most difficult conversations I've ever had in my life. That was a very tough interview. Tim, the publisher at Orbit, is a brilliant man who knows how to ask difficult questions. And I learned a lot even from just that interview. I was an editor there for 3 years, jumped from there to an ebook startup, in part because this is the point at which Amazon ebook marketplace looked like it was going to eat all of publishing. And so I wanted to be part of a solution there. So I jumped to working on that startup for several years. And after that, wanted to get back into working more directly with writers, and realized that in the intervening years as an editor and then working inside a startup, I sort of developed all the skills I didn't have when I tried to be an agent the first time that would be useful to me now. And so I didn't want to work for a big company. I wanted to work really closely with writers. I had gotten really good at pitching, and had gotten over a lot of my social anxiety and fear about doing those kind of things at that point. So then I jumped back into agenting at that point at the agency where I'm at now, Howard Moorheim Literary, and all the connections I had as an editor really helped me get started as an agent. Was able to hit the ground running doing that. So that's like the speed run 10,000 foot view of what my career looks like, of me kind of doing like a full lap around the business, from starting on agenting, going to editorial, working in-house, going to digital book sales, like actually working on the direct sales side, and the building a publishing business side taught me all the things about how this stupid industry is bolted together. And then coming back to agenting, having that full suite of skills, having that full sort of 360 awareness of how the business works really helps me on an ongoing basis navigate how to talk to publishers, how to communicate with publishers, all those kind of things. So in terms of getting an editing job in 2024, unfortunately, I don't have a lot of great advice for you. A lot of the advice for how I got started was very oriented to a different world and different market, because at that point, all of publishing was incredibly New York centric. To work in publishing, you had to physically be in New York. I happened to already be there. I moved there right out of school, took a job at PBS. I had interned there for 2 summers. I was working as a research PA for Bill Moyers. So like I was in the city already, and was already making enough salary that I could afford an apartment, all that. I was like up and running, and was able to network with people who were already in publishing. I also had a leg up there because I have a family member. My cousin is a literary agent, so like had some connections through her as well and things like that, right? So for me, it was going to drinks events, writers events, readings, things like that, to network, meet people in publishing, and connect that way. I recommend you still try to do that, right? Find ways to connect with people who work in publishing. The best ways to do that is to go to places where they'll be. So cons, conferences, workshops, readings, any kind of free event you can. If you're in New York, especially, just try and meet people who work in publishing and make those connections. Now, one piece of advice I would give you is don't try to network with people who are like senior, right? You're not trying to like make friends with the person who is the decision maker for the role you're trying to get. You're trying to make friends with people who are at your level or one step ahead of you, right? Because those are the people who will tell you about the opportunity and then pass your resume along to the person who actually is making those decisions, right? If they're a senior editor, if they're an executive editor, if they're a publisher, they're not going to remember somebody that they met at a party one time. They may, if you had a nice chat, you know what I mean? But they're not going to be the one who's going to be like, oh, hey, we're hiring an assistant, I'm going to email you. That's going to be more the whisper network of the people at your level that you're connected to. So when I talk about publishing being about networking, it's not about knowing people who are very senior and in power. It's about knowing people who will tell you what's up. And those are the people who tend to be more at your level or one step ahead of you, right? So if you want to get an editing job, my advice, unfortunately, is still a little bit move to New York City if you can figure out a way to make it work. Go to as many book-related things as you can. If you can afford it, one of those publishing programs, the NYU program, the Columbia program, can be really helpful. those are like about networking more than anything else. I don't think publishers are really looking at those as like, oh, this person's trained up and is going to have all the skills. I think they're looking at it in terms of like, this is a reliable pool of people to pull from who are interested in working in publishing, who've been somewhat vetted, you know what I mean? But that's a very expensive way to do that. It's not necessarily something I recommend. I've taught at the NYU program. It's a great program. I'm not saying you don't learn things from it, but it's not a prerequisite to get into publishing. So that's kind of my high level response there. If you have like a little bit more granular questions, drop them in the chat. I'll try to answer them later if I can. But it really is making the connections, getting someone to hand your resume to the person that you will be working for. If you're trying to work in editorial or in agenting, you want somebody who will get your resume in front of the person who's actually going to be hiring you. That's the main thing you're trying to do. And it's very tough if you're just going through the portal. If you're just going through the HR portal, you're in the same pool with hundreds of candidates, and the odds of you getting plucked from that, it definitely happens. It's just a little bit trickier. So my advice is get to know people and get someone to hand your resume up the chain. So that's it.
Hey, the next question seems like a me question.
Yeah, your turn.
Does Howard miss any parts of having a daily webcomic, and would he ever want to do another one again? Yes, and yes. With a huge caveat, I don't have the ability to do a daily webcomic again. Not unless I pared things way down or was just doing the writing or something, because I'm physically not up to that anymore. What do I miss about having a daily webcomic? Honestly, the thing that I miss the most is the superpower years before I got sick, when I could get up at 6 a.m, work for 12 hours, do assorted biologicals, eat, go for a walk, go to the gym, whatever, go to bed at midnight and snap awake in the morning and do it all again. I loved that so much. And that's just not the life I have anymore. Yes, I also miss just the sequential online storytelling part of it. As we mentioned at the beginning of the episode in the answer to the very first question, currently suffering from a slump. So there's a million things I miss about having a creative, an ongoing creative project right now in front of me. And that's the short answer. I'll leave the long answer for another day.
All right. Moving on. How do you know when a book is ready to query? They seem to make sure a book is the best it can be, but they also say you can edit your work forever, and at some point you have to turn it in. This is a great question, one I see quite a bit. My general answer to this is editing is about a series of questions. It's not like a task list of the number of things to do. It's like being aware that there are unanswered questions or questions about what to do with something that isn't working quite right? And so the way I talk about knowing when to submit a book, when to stop working on it and just get it out there, is when you've run out of questions that you know how to answer, right? When you hit the end of the road of like, I know there are questions that remain here, which may just be like, is this particular plot arc working? Is it in the right category exactly? Does it need to be pushed more in this direction or this direction, right? Does it need to be more horror? Does it need to be more romantasy? Does it need to be more X, Y, Z? Is it YA? Is it middle grade, right? Like sometimes they're really big questions, sometimes they're very small, specific questions, right? When you need other people to have eyes on it in a certain way that you've done everything you can in terms of answering, is the main character arc fun? Is it exciting? Is the pitch good? Is XYZ good, right? Once you have those locked down, that's the point at which you start saying, okay, I now need a team to work with me on this. And that's when you start looking for an agent. When you're looking for someone who has the expertise to answer questions that you don't know how to answer, that you don't have the tools to answer. So in terms of, you want to be putting your best foot forward. You don't want to be going out with something that's half-assed, or has only done like one editing pass. Like, make sure that you really are taking your best shot when you're reaching out to those agents. But also recognize that when you're just pushing things around because you don't know what else to do with it, when you genuinely are at a point of, I don't know what questions to ask or how to answer the questions that I still have, that's the point at which you're like, I gotta put this down. I gotta stop working on it and move on.
I think the quote is attributed to Leonardo da Vinci. Art is never finished, only abandoned.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, sending something off to query does not, saying that it's now been abandoned is not necessarily a positive thought. But yeah, at some point you just have to stop working on it and start working on the next thing. It's a point of diminishing returns. You will hit the point where it is 80% perfect, 80% of what you think would be perfect, but you don't know what that last 20% is. And you can spend as much time in that last 20% as you spent in the first 80%. And you are more likely to write lots of books if you spend your time in the 80% and let other people help you with the 20%.
Exactly. You want to read the next question?
The one from Amber or the one I answered from Sarah?
Up to you. Your choice.
Sarah asked, how many Writing Excuses team members does it take to make one episode of the podcast? And I wrote 6, 1 to set up the microphones and 5 to be not that smart, for various values of 5.
Yeah.
And then Amber asked, how many Writing Excuses team members does it take to screw in a light bulb? And there's a right way and a wrong way to tell this joke. If you say change a light bulb, then I can say, oh, just one, but the light bulb has to really want to change, because that's kind of how Writing Excuses works. But if you say screw in a light bulb, I go straight to the mouse joke. How many mice does it take to screw in a light bulb? Just 2. The trick is getting them into the light bulb.
Terrible.
Anyway.
Absolutely criminal.
Anyway, should we?
I will say, going back to the original question, Sarah's question, I would also point out, there's admin support that goes into that as well, and then there's our producer as well. So on any given episode, and our wonderful editor, Alex, and so on any given episode, there can be up to 9-10 hands touching it by the time it goes out the door, between admin support, those of us on the podcast, any guests we have, Marshall, who's our recording engineer, Emma, who's our podcast producer. All those people are helping us figure out different components of it, from technical to planning to, logistical support, all of that. So
there's a minimum of 3 people, minimum, and
minimum of 3. Yeah.
Marshall and Emma and Alex. If I am involved, I count twice, because I have to have Sandra helping me. And so, the number, what you hear is not the number of people who worked on it. What you hear is the number of people who happen to be in front of microphones.
Exactly. We do a lot to try and make sure our production is as lightweight as possible. And, we're always trying to find ways to be quicker, more efficient about how we do things, just because we're all incredibly busy people. And, the budget is the budget, right? Like, we appreciate all the people who support us through Patreon. You all have heard us running ads now. All of that helps us keep staff on board to do all the support work that we need to make the podcast happen. And it takes a lot. So it's always just trying to keep it as lean, as efficient as we can, while still being fun for us to do, and, keeping up the useful conversation that you guys are getting in terms of helping you figure out your process. So,
yep. Okay, I'm going to read Javi's question.
Yes.
We know this is a business with a lot of survivorship bias. If there was a failureship bias for a career in the arts, obvious or not obvious, what would they be? That is a fantastic question, and
Yeah.
I've been grinding the mental wheels on it for a while, and uh, and I think the survivorship bias happens because the people who talk about writing are the people who have succeeded enough at writing that they can spend the time talking about writing.
Yeah.
Um, in order to find the failureship bias, you have to find the group of people who are talking about, oh yeah, I tried to write a novel and couldn't, and I hated it, and I could never find the time, and they are commiserating one with another, and I don't know where. And that's the
Mhm.
problem with survivorship bias, is that we don't know where to go find the other voices so that we can
Mhm.
learn from the failures. It's a great
I,
question.
I love this question. It's such a good question. It is a very difficult one to answer. And I'm going to talk a little about why it's so difficult to answer. I see this a lot as a literary agent, as an industry person, as somebody who has seen hundreds of books get across the finish line, who has been adjacent to thousands of books getting across the finish line, right? And seeing what works and what doesn't work. And then I see individual authors talk about their experience and present that in a way that here's the path to success. It's XYZ. This is what I did. It worked. This is how you do it. And I'm like, that worked for you. I know 10 other people who tried almost the exact same thing and it didn't work for them. Right. And so survivorship bias is really tough in books in particular because each book is a unique product. Each author is a unique career. And there are very few things that translate easily from one career to the next career, even from one book to the next book, right? Like I've seen authors be like, this worked last time. Why isn't it working this time? And it's because the market's different. Each book is its own little bespoke piece of content that needs to be put out in the world. And marketing conditions change, right? Social media collapses, digital marketing tactics change, bookstores go out of business, entire formats disappear, right? Like all kinds of things can happen overnight that will affect the success of any individual book. And so, from an individual author's perspective, it can be really hard to have clarity about what worked and what didn't work. Now, I have an opposite bias. My bias is so generalized to things do kind of work out in aggregate because if you publish enough books, then one of them is going to hit, one of them is going to take off, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So I have a slightly different perspective that also gives me a bias that I have to be cognizant of because sometimes I can be a little dismissive of an author's concerns, or I can be a little bit be like, or a little too understanding of a publisher's issues or something like that because I've seen it so many times, right? I have a survivorship bias in the other sense of like I have calluses, right? Like I'm like, you know, a professional cook telling the home chef like, "Oh, you burned your hand on a pot, like boohoo, too bad for you." And I'm like, "Oh wait, no, that sucks. It sucks every time you burn your hand. It's not fun every time, even if I've done it 100 times and they've only done it twice, right?" And so there are all these different biases that go in here. In terms of this question about is there a failureship bias, which is such a great question. I love this framing. The thing that I would say, the thing that I see leading to states where it's impossible to get the success you're looking for is bitterness, right? The thing that I see infect a writer's mind as they are looking at their career, as they're trying to figure out what moves they have left to make, as they're trying to figure out what their options are, is a kind of deep negativity about the industry, about the state of the world, about the critical landscape, about what other fiction is out there, right? If you let that bitterness drive you from a creative point or a professional point, then it almost guarantees, in my experience, that it's going to be really hard to get you to where you're trying to get to, right? It's like, it's not just I'm not pitching the wish here, right? This isn't like the power of magical thinking, but also people respond to a positive energy. And if you're putting a positive energy out there, then people will bring that back to you. And because publishing is a social business in so many ways, that if you are bringing negativity to your publishing team, if you're bringing negativity to the process, then you're not going to be met with the excitement and enthusiasm that you need to get across the finishing line in a powerful and exciting way, right? And so the failureship bias that I see tank careers, dominate conversations. And when I see older writers giving advice to young writers that are rooted in that kind of negativity and bitterness, I get really frustrated because it's giving them advice that isn't serving them, that isn't making space for the possibility of success, right? And listen, I'm the first one to say that every part of this process is really hard. It's very difficult to write a great book. It's very difficult to market a book well. It's very difficult to meet wild success doing this, professionally. It, the whole thing is difficult. It's stacked against any individual writer. But also, every day, new writers are coming on the scene and meeting wild success. Every day, there are bestsellers being made. Every day, people are getting to achieve the artistic and financial goals that they set out with at the beginning of their career, right? So if you choose to believe that that's not attainable for you, then guess what? It's not going to be attainable for you. Now, choosing to believe that it is attainable is probably going to involve some heartbreak because it's never a straight road to get there, right? It's never an easy climb to get there. But it's finding that balance point about realism and clarity about what business you're working in, and not letting a failure bias overwhelm you as you're figuring out how to navigate it. I don't know if any of that's making sense, but to me, it's hugely, hugely, hugely important. And it's the thing that I have seen just ruin careers of people who are enormously talented and should be on top of the world. And this isn't me blaming them for that. It is, however, me saying that, like, you have to find a way to stay in an excited, engaged, and generative space.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is key to understanding a given bias, survivorship bias. The danger of a survivorship bias is that you have a group of people who have succeeded and they compare notes and they determine that, oh, well, these factors that we all have in common must be the key elements for success. And until you talk to people who have failed, you don't know if that's actually true. By the same token, there are probably things being passed around that are wrong principles about what you need to do to succeed, that are, among the folks who have failed. One of the things that I want to point out is that this podcast, when we first launched, it was Howard and Brandon and Dan, and Brandon had books published and Howard had a webcomic and Dan had things out on Query, and that was it. And so it is easy for people to look at the history of writing excuses and say, if I want to succeed as a writer, I need to do a podcast because then I can get a book deal, because that's how Dan Wells did it. Well, no, that's not how Dan Wells did it. That's just what it looks like because of the timing of things. I've met people at conventions who are convinced that one of the paths to publishing success is getting to be on panels because they see authors on panels and then those authors come out with new books and they do well. And that's very cart in front of horse. And it is important that we recognize that, here at Writing Excuses, we're responsible for creating some of these biases, for propping up some of these ideas. And I'll be the first to go on the record to say I had a successful webcomic because I worked hard and I was ignorant and I was lucky. If I hadn't been ignorant, I would have been too terrified to keep going. And if I hadn't been lucky, nothing would have happened at all. And if I hadn't worked hard, all the ignorance and all the luck in the world wouldn't have helped. Um, but but there are people who are lucky and who are ignorant and who work hard who still fail. And wow, this question, I think Nassim Nicholas Taleb, I think that's the author's name, in The Black Swan, described failureship bias as the cemetery. You go and you look in the cemetery and you get the histories of all of those people in order to figure out what they had in common that your survivors also have in common, so that you can rule those out as rules. We could talk about this for the rest of the night, Dongwon. We should pick
absolutely we could. It's a huge question, one I think about a lot as somebody who is trying to give advice professionally about how to navigate this business and how to be a successful writer. I know all too well that there is no magic bullet, and if there's only one lesson that you take away from listening to me talk about this stuff, is that it's me saying that there is no magic bullet, and each time you kind of got to figure it out from the ground up. I mean, there are things that, anyways, yeah, I'm gonna cut myself off, because you're right. I will just keep talking about this all night long, because it's an endless rabbit hole, and a fascinating and challenging one. But okay, so the next question may be in the same ballpark as the last one. As publishers change over the last few years, what are agents and publishers looking for, which we may not have heard about yet? Do any of those things revise the advice we've given to authors in the past few years? Fascinating question. Great question. Also a tough one.
In terms of ballpark, that's a very insider baseball question too.
It is, yes.
Hey,
yes. We are...
spill the tea for me. What is your favorite editor looking for right now, Dongwon?
I mean, the answer is going to go into the question after this, but romantasy. They all want romantasy right now. It's the flavor of the month, and it's doing very, very well. So on a broad level, romance was a really tough thing 5 years ago, 7 years ago. Now it is doing incredibly well, and now it is sort of the backbone of a lot of the genre publishing lines that we're seeing. So that's one thing. That's like the quick, easy answer. One broad thing I would say is social media platform is way less important than it used to be. Revising that advice is, as social media has kind of collapsed as a viable marketing outlet, it is, which is the thing I say a lot in an offhanded way, and I've not really explained why I think that or what I mean by that, but which we should get into at some point. But I think social media has gotten more and more difficult as an avenue to promote yourself as a writer, unless you are an active content producer, right? Influencer, that's what I'm looking for, or a content creator. If you're doing that in a really active, ongoing way, then I think it is easier to build that. I think if you're looking to get the kind of organic awareness that you used to be able to get off of having a Twitter profile, being on Instagram, whatever it is, being on Facebook, those things are getting harder and harder and harder. So one general advice is worry a lot less about social media. Do worry about newsletter still. Do worry about having a digital footprint still. That's still important. But am I back? Okay.
You're back. Digital footprint still, but
digital footprint is still important. Having a stable internet connection also important if you're trying to do a live stream. That's the other thing I'll say. Aside from that, I mean, other things they're looking for, who knows? And it'll change pretty soon anyways. In terms of big trends, those are the ones I can point to. Romantasy is doing really well. Horror still strong. Social media less important than it used to be. Unless you're talking about like book talk virality, which is a specific kind of thing that's hard to get access and generate. So that's the high level.
Yeah, I've given this advice before. Get a domain, hang your shingle on that, use your newsletter to guide people to that. And then, hey, if the new social 5.0 comes out and is taking everything by storm, sure, participate on that, with that, whatever, but don't give up on that original shingle, because we've seen a dozen times or more big platforms that people were using to connect with their base get ripped out from under them.
Oh, SEO and search is changing radically right now.
Yeah.
It's all being replaced by AI tools. So God only knows how Google search results will work in 30 seconds from now, much less. And so my advice is stick to core techniques of having a presence online, having digital footprint. It's why Howard's saying that's why I say that. But what traditionally worked for SEO is almost guaranteed going to be different in a year. So we are all riding this insane digital wave of changes on the digital frontier as everything gets AI-ified in the worst way as possible, and human knowledge is being degraded by the moment. So, yay.
My beard is probably a deep fake. there's no way this is real.
That's just absolutely not. Absolutely not. I'm just going to go pixel by pixel and make sure each strand is lined up properly to make sure it's
That'll
real.
be a good use of your time too.
Exactly.
The next question, the question about the best and worst things about the romantasy trend. I just wanted to point out that the one of the original reviews in the UK of Tolkien's Fellowship of the Ring referred to Fellowship of the Ring as a romance. The term romance did not mean the same thing as it means now, genre-wise. Romance meant a stirring of emotions and whatever, and all fantasy in that time period was romance. That is not what romantasy means, but I find it fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, epic fantasy has deep roots in the romantic tradition in a classical sense, and I could talk about that for 2 hours. However, I will have a much shorter response to this question, which is, I don't have a lot to say about romantasy. I'm not a big reader of romantasy, so I feel a little bit out of step with this current boom. I have nothing against it. I think it's thrilling and exciting, and I think it's doing really well. And obviously it's blowing up. Obviously it's selling 1 billion copies. And anytime that's happening, I think it's good for the industry, right? I think this level of interest from readers, from publishers, from booksellers, this kind of volume and momentum is great. I don't like it when it starts to push out opportunities for other genres, other categories. If it feels like the air is being taken out of the room for different kinds of writing, that can be really frustrating. And it's inevitable that happens a little bit. I think people panicking about it are overstating it. You know what I mean? It's my general sense. But, in general, romantasy, I think, is a little bit of a misnomer. I think a lot of what people call romantasy. Okay, I'm back. I think a lot of what people call romantasy is really epic fantasy from a perspective of a woman writer, and more concern about different aspects of the range of human emotions. That, never mind. Am I back?
Yeah, more emotionally grounded.
I think more emotionally grounded. I think more interested in the emotional interiority of the major characters, right? Yeah. And some of it's more romance oriented and some of it is less. And I think a lot of stuff is going to be rounded up into romantasy in the same way that we round up any story that takes place in space. We're like, it's a space opera. I'm like, 90% of what we're calling space opera doesn't really fit the technical definition. You know what I mean? And that doesn't really matter. I mean, I think romantasy is going to be a useful marketing term. I think it is driving so much excitement and interest in the category, and that kicks ass. I love seeing people on the internet who have nothing, who are not people who would ever be seen in a genre space or a con or show up to, or even awareness really of what we're doing deep in the core of the genre, be really excited about Sarah J. Maas, be really excited about Rebecca Yarros, whatever it is, right? I think that kicks ass. I love that they're reading fantasy. I love that they're looking for more stuff, and I think that's only for the good. So I think that's my general take on it. In terms of horror, which is the second half of this question, I think the horror boom has been really wonderful. I hope it continues. It's one of my. It's. I do read horror. I love horror. I like working in horror. So on a personal level, I hope the horror boom continues. It's been very thrilling and fun to work in, and it's never going to be big as Romantasy, and it hasn't been as big as Romantasy, and I think that's totally fine. I also think it's probably a little bit more sustainable as a result. So I'm excited to see sort of how that grows and develops. And we're seeing whole new imprints being launched behind Romantasy, though, and I think those are going to be here for quite some time. So, anyways, that's my overall high-level thoughts. More books, good. I have no real complaints here.
More books, good. Hey, so the last question we've got here. Writing technique question. For people who hate writing action/fight scenes, and then parenthetical, people who may or may not be me, how do you fight your way through them and come out with a strong scene? I'm going to say that you do this the same way you write a sex scene or a cooking scene or an auto mechanic scene or anything that has a character doing a thing or multiple characters doing a thing, whether or not it's a contest, whether or not they're competing, sports, it'd be just like sports. And when I say it's exactly the same, there have to be emotional stakes. We have to care about what they're doing. Yes. If we care about what they're doing, and you've described it well enough to get me from the beginning to the end of the scene in a way that I understand your story, you win. That may seem like a low bar. It's actually a very high bar, because I've read some very technical, very accurate fight scenes which did nothing for me. And it is possible that if you hate writing fight scenes, it's because those are the fight scenes that you're reading and that you may be modeling after. Put some emotion in it. Make yourself care about what these people are doing. And then we, the reader, will care, and you will have succeeded.
A fight scene should involve two people entering who want different things, and that gets resolved in some way over the course of the scene, right? If the outcome of the scene is untouched by, or if the character's feelings or wants or needs are untouched by the action of the scene, then you should not have that scene. You should just cut it, right? If you want the best example of this, a book I recommend all the time, but Fonda Lee's Jade City, I think is some of the best action writing I've ever read, in part because she is incredibly good at walking into an action scene where you really deeply understand what every character wants and how this fight is going to determine the future of that going forward, right? So Fonda Lee is a great example of this. My recommendation to you, if you want to write great action scenes, is learn to love great action scenes, right? If you want to get good at it, you got to learn to like it. You're not going to get good at it without that. So the homework I would give you is go watch every Jackie Chan movie you can find, because that man knows how to structure and pace an action scene like nobody else in a way that provides clear stakes, clear goals. They're lighthearted, so you can generally have a pretty clear understanding of what the character is trying to accomplish over the course of the scene. And once you learn how to parse the action in the scene and understand what he's trying to accomplish and how he's doing it, and because they're quite broad, they're more legible than, I don't know, trying to parse a John Wick action scene, for example. And I think John Wick's greatest failing as a film is that the stakes are often missing in later scenes, or in the later movies. I think the first movie did a great job of that. I think as the series has gone on, the action scenes have become more and more tedious to me because they don't have those stakes. So go watch Jackie Chan movies, go watch The Raid, go watch the great action movies. And those are the ones that you'll learn from seeing how they do it, how to really vibe with what makes a great action scene. And it's saying that makes any great scene, which is characters evolving and growing and changing over the course of the scene. If everybody leaves the scene the same way they went in, something's not working.
One of my favorite superhero action scenes is in the David Harbour Hellboy movie, where Hellboy is fighting the giants. I love that scene so much. Hellboy is outnumbered. He's already wounded. He has had a terrible day, and he just wants to not do this. And the giants want to eat him. And anyway, it's I love it. Unequivocally, I love it.
All right. Well, we are out of time. We ran a little bit over. Thank you guys for all of your excellent questions. And thank you for those of you in the Discord who dropped those in. It is always lovely to chat with y'all every month and answer some of these questions.
Big thanks to Sarah, who collected those questions for us.
Absolutely.
Stepped up. We looked like we weren't going to have much to talk about. And then we had so much to talk about. We ran 10 minutes over and have 3 2-hour future podcasts queued up from topics that you've given us.
If you want to put questions in for the future, sorry, I cut out again, but I think you wrapped up what you were saying. If you want to add, oh, there I go again. Come on, internet. Let me do my outro.
I can hear you now. You're good.
Okay. Excellent. Anyways, Jesus Christ. If you want to submit your question for next month's stream, you can join us on Patreon, writing excuse or patreon.com/writing excuses. There's a tier, that's the Q&A tier, that lets you submit questions ahead of time that we will answer on stream for you all. For everything else, you can check us out on Instagram at Writing Excuses, Twitter and Blue Sky also at Writing Excuses. And thank you so much for joining me, Howard.
This was fun.
Thank you to everyone for coming. This is fun. I love doing these. All right, you're out of excuses. Now go write.
Good night, everybody.